It's nice to be back in this room. I haven't spoken here for a decade. It's been that long since I've been attended. Actually, last year I spoke at Princeton, and I got up and said it's nice to be back. I haven't been here for 8 years. And someone said, yes, I heard you. I'm still working on my degree. So I hope nobody's still working on their degree after a decade here. Now, even though I said I'm going to work on Orthodoxy, I'm going to start off with the India part first. So last year I taught in a place called Varieties Hindu University in the city of Varanasi, the holy city of Hinduism. Now, at the end of 1898, the university was founded specifically to take all the old-style teaching that used to be done in people's homes, in which you would have a teacher and they would have a circle of followers and disciples around it, and modernize it by bringing it into a university. And of that, now the university culture is completely Brahmin, it's completely Orthodox. The students walked in and kissed the hem of my pants when they walk in, saying, Professor G. It's completely traditional, it's all vegetarian, all religious campus. But at the same time, everything is now rational. Prior texts that you do here in a religion course are treated as allegories or given modern explanations. They wouldn't even understand most of what you learn in a course in Indian religions here in America because they're modern. And that's certainly not these computer scientists and biotechnical engineers certainly see the world in a modern way. And even beyond that, you see the street fairs that everybody likes to go to. They would say, oh yeah, that's just for the uneducated. But we who are educated, that's not the real Hinduism. The real Hinduism is what we do as the upper class Orthodox. Now the point that I want to make here is that when you look at a book on what is modern Hinduism, you immediately go for the Hindu reformers, the neo-Hindu approaches, the Vivekananda, the Ramakrishnans, the Gandhi, very modernists. But places like Varieties Hindu University themselves are a form of a modern orthodoxy without changing it, they still think they're Orthodox, and it's a different entrance into modernity. Or going up in northern New Jersey, there's a lot of an influx of immigrants from the Indian subcontinent, and they're now all forming forms of Hinduism that are rational, this worldly, scientific. They're putting down ritual and being ritually strict as Orthodox, but at the same time, they're completely modernizing everything, that everything is science, the past is an allegory, and that it fits in with modern categories of everything from Western philosophy to media. That's the sort of thing I'm going to be dealing with within Judaism, that rather than we think of it in terms of modernization as being, let's look at the reform or the trend to modern or the change, let's look at how the traditional religion modernized. Okay? Which in the same way, since I teach in a Catholic university, is how do they, same thing as the Catholicism has a very contemporary 21st century air to it, and that you would look at, you would deal with figures about how they deal with modernity, even if they're not radically changing anything. Now first the phrase modern orthodoxy, and I see we have some students here who may be modern Orthodox. The phrase only came to be in the first time, capital M, capital O, in 1977. There was no modern Orthodoxy before that point. And that's really something to think about. Before that point, it was used already in the early 1960s by what Rabbi Manuel Rackman said, a cadre of individuals limited to a score of rabbis whose interpretation of tradition has won the approval of Orthodox intellectuals, or another rabbi at the time, Rabbi Walter Wurzburger, who says it's a small alienated minority. I mean, modern Orthodoxy was only originally meant in the 1960s, those few intellectuals trying to grapple with modern philosophy or modern social science. It did not refer to a social movement. But sometime after 77, into the 1980s, it became capitalized, now referring to a social movement called Modern Orthodoxy, and now applied to neighborhoods, synagogues, day schools, and they all call themselves, capital M, capital O, Modern Orthodoxy. But if they're now calling themselves Modern Orthodoxy, you have the problem is, so what was beforehand? Some of you already said, what do you mean 77? Wasn't there Modern Orthodoxy beforehand? So the term became retrograded in a very funny way, trying to look for antecedents, what the antecedents were, creating all sorts of genealogies that never existed. And you should know that Hirsch had not even been translated into English until 1991. Creating all sorts of antecedents that never were there for a very American movement. But on the other hand, there are some things that have all the forms of modern orthodoxy, or all things that they saw a genealogy have in common. And in this I rely on people who work in the early 19th century, people like Doreen Rossman with her Evolution of English Churches, that says that she's going to start modernity with when people stopped worrying about the afterlife, their entry to heaven. They stopped thinking you belong to a confraternity and having to appeal to beyond. When they stopped appealing to magical rites and to metaphysical rites in order to heal. That's a cutoff point that anyone after that point, you can say in some way, is engaging not with the early modern or Baroque periods, but engaging with the modern period. And the case example, I'm taking Rabbi Shmuel David Luzada, known as Shadal, who is the first one who people look back as one of these retrograded modern Orthodox. And in his autobiography, he writes in 1814 that his mother laid fatally ill on bed. And his father pleads with him, your mother's ill, please say the Kabbalistic intentions. That's the only way she can get better. And he answers, no, I believe in modern science. He also, at that point, also says he believes in the study of Hebrew grammar. He believes in the study of the Bible separately from tradition. He believes in now having to read the Western literature. He bears a lot of factors that make him one of the first of this modern sequence. Second problem here is, what does the word modern mean? And you can even hear it now in 2015, somebody saying to somebody else, gee, this person's not really a modern Orthodox. What does that make them? Does it make them medieval? It'll say, oh, usually people want whatever they think is progressive, and we'll call that modern. But that also has to be cleared up. In that, what does modern mean? And for this, I'm going to use the sociologist Anthony Giddens, who talks about 3 stages of modernity, and that'll help clear up some of our discussion before we get started. First of all, the 3 stages are going to be Enlightenment, Aufklärung, modernity, and late modernity. The Enlightenment period, starting at the end of the 18th century in the Jewish case and going through most of the 19th, is now the acknowledgement of what the modern world calls science, philosophy, middle-class society, politics. Kant defines enlightenments as a human release from the immaturity that we now use autonomous reason rather than authority or belief in miracles. Moses Mendelssohn defined this first stage of enlightenment as modifications of social life to lead a better condition. But in all of this time period of modernity, the emphasis is on literacy, education, accepting the scientific worldview, because the alternative is still living in some 17th century world in which you are more likely in these lands to have spoken some sort of Judeo-German, most likely to still relied on magic or Kabbalah. All sorts of things have been changed. And therefore, when you say somebody's modern or not, almost always in 2015, you're going to find very few that you're going to be debating about that are not that Enlightenment sense of modern. The second form of modern is modernism, which someplace between 1870 and 1960, we have a whole bunch of new ways of looking at the world that are very university-centered. Whether it's going to be modernism, the emergence of the social sciences, the emergence of movements like existentialism, movements like fields like anthropology, evolutionary thinking in geology and biology, the rise of modern psychology. All of those are forms of modernism. And so when the word modern orthodoxy became coined in the late 1950s, early 1960s, it was that few score of intellectuals that thought they were grappling with those issues. But the majority of congregations were just ordinary Orthodox and never really grappled with it. Looking back, social scientists will say, were we ever really modern? The answer is no. The average congregant in 1955 barely had a high school diploma at best, and really wasn't modern in grappling, in the Jewish case, with any of the social sciences or philosophy, except for those few score of individuals. Now the third phrase of late modernity, which whether you want to start it someplace in the 1980s till now, is now a period in when the great narratives of modernity, the great sense of progress has fallen away. And we now see a world that's much more fragile, much more precarious. There's no more certain answers, like if we only bring social science, everything will be cured. If we only brought Western knowledge, everything will be cured, there'll be no fighting. That doesn't exist, and we live more of an age of risk management than we live in an age of certainty anymore. And this has also been a very good age for religion the last 30 years, because now you can say, I don't believe in science, or I don't believe in vaccine for measles, or whatever you can believe in, and it's okay. Because it's all the way judgment call at this point. There's no one who's going to label you an uneducated primitive in an absolute sense that there might have been at some other point. To return to the religious aspect, in the first period of the Enlightenment, all religions had to show they're not superstitious, they're not fanatical, they're not supernatural. So whether it's the case in Benares in India, that they all became very rational Brahmins, speaking a language of 19th century at least, if not 21st, and they all now read books and are on computers, things are now seen as rational, this worldly, and that became the orientation for religion. There are some sea-changing books that came out in the last few decades. We have some historians here, like Ulrich Lerner in his religious side of the Enlightenment, points out how much modern culture did not really go the view of the deist, or what we call Enlightenment philosophy. The average rank and file, take a Catholic case, became enlightened in that they continued to become church-going, but they now took the stances that were anti-Baroque, anti-superstition, anti-folk festivals. They rejected a lot of the mysticism and monasticism, and they believed now everyone had to have a broader education with science and historic criticism, and at the same time belonging to your diocese. And it was modified. When we come now to the second type of modernity, modern religion, we now have religious authors who are writing books trying to create religious existentialism. They're probably still on your syllabi. Trying to combine the idea that trying to still find God, but now using things like James's category of religious experience, or talking about we now live in a disenchanted world. How do we get back to God? Meaning in the second period of modernity, The goal was less doing away with superstition and increasing literacy, and more about dealing with a very specific corpus. And now in our recent period of late modernity, we have the ability now to, people are looking for certain values, moral orders, how to manage risks. The last 30 years, or at least 25 years, have been incredibly kind to evangelicals, Mormons, Orthodox Jews, Swaminarayan Hinduism, and other forms of highly committed religion. Because in some way, these are seen as having the best answers for dealing with our complex lives of career, suburbia, media. In some way, they're providing a moral answer. But what's interesting is that they're doing so not as medievals, but with not being the early 20th century modernists. They don't have to quote much of the modernist literature anymore, but they're now managing things on a very different level, a much more internal level, as a way of dealing with things. Moving now to the chart that you all have in front of you. I'm going to talk about varieties of modern Orthodox, and rather than there being a genealogy, there's actually several different types, and I use this chart from many different angles of this. Sometimes I do an entirely Jewish one just as a chart, in which people ask me also the fine details. But we're doing much more bigger issues tonight. But let's go through some of them. The first one was just traditionalism, high church religion. In most countries like Italy or France or Suriname, the early modern world, the Baroque world, ended very quickly with the Napoleonic armies, in that monasteries were closed and yeshivot were closed. What opened in their place was seminaries. So the same way yeshivot will close in Alsace-Lorraine, and instead you'll have a seminary in Paris and a seminary in Padua. It was not an ideological decision, but the youth, like Chadal, we now believe in reading science, reading history, becoming literate, educating our children for one of the new professions. And it was taken as a given that science is correct, that the importance of getting educated, and for thinking for yourself. If we turn to the specific British version of it, the specific British version of this was that the very high church, very wealthy Montefiore, Rothschild families, and others created a high church of Judaism, in some way modeled after the Anglican Catholic model, in which you will now have rabbis wearing clerical gowns, mixed choirs, and the most important thing is now going to be the sermon as the high point in the sermon. And it focused now on synagogue life. It never needed an ideological moment. It was an automatic moment. And since I just gave this talk recently in England, unlike America, where most of the forms of modern Orthodoxy were started by the immigrants, not by the wealthy, in England it was started entirely top-down, in which things like sing-along or only meeting in a storefront were seen as not acceptable. And also in England, the entire movement, it didn't fracture further like it did in America. The third one I'm going to deal with, and bringing it a little closer to home, is the Hebrew humanism, a long-forgotten group, but are essential for any discussion of modern Orthodoxy. Is in Russia, Rav Yitzchak Reines, formerly part of the religious establishment in Russia, saw that there was incredible poverty, unemployment, no future for the Russian masses. And he broke with the yeshiva world, which had no particular interest in helping the people, and started a movement called religious Zionism. And much of the platform had to do with productivity, literacy, and a new education system that's going to focus on Jewish history, language, Bible, and not the old rabbinic education. That idea is going to be put on hold very quickly in both Russia and elsewhere, both because of the famine in Middle East and because of Russian Revolution. But it's going to, in some way, immediately from 1917 on, almost all the religious Zionists are going to live in America. And they are going to create a basis for most American, what we call modern Orthodoxy now, but at that point it was called Mizrahi, the religious Zionists in America. They were the ones responsible for founding almost every day school, Talmud Torah, Hebrew school, and educational system in America. They went from town to town, from Scranton to San Francisco to Toronto, back to Brooklyn, founding almost any institution you know, even if they later merged. They're the ones who created things you may know, like an elementary school education that focuses on the study of Hebrew and Bible in a Jewish day school, that believes in teaching you Joshua and Judges, because they get to pull down maps and show you the land of Israel. Have you know, in British traditionalism, they spend just as much time teaching you Proverbs and Psalms. Much more Anglican approach rather than the Joshua Judges. They're the ones who created, for those who know Hebrew, the Alma Ne'amars and Amil Mar Lami, the who said to who and what is it talking about, because it was all about a textual knowledge and they were going to be they thought that their way was going to be the future toward this new Hebrew humanism. Because at the same time you're teaching Hebrew, you're now setting up a modern day school with science, with English. But they all left America between 51 and 54. As soon as the state of Israel was founded and they could get over there, they left and they're forgotten. And their institutions went to a very new group, who we'll talk about in a few minutes. The fourth one that I'm talking about is the eternal Torah true Orthodoxy. In Germany, just like in France and Italy, the yeshivot were taken down by the Napoleonic armies. The changes of modernity occurred. But unlike England, France, Italy, in Germany, we got ultra-Orthodoxy coming to be on one side and a reform movement on the other side, which created a very different tone, a much narrower tone, in which they felt simultaneously that they would have to fight on both sides. Now they had to pick what they wanted to fight and what not to fight. But to talk a little bit about their nature, they tended to teach Bible also, and then that's appropriate for children's education. But they didn't teach Joshua Judges. They taught Isaiah, Psalms, Jeremiah, Micah. They wanted an ethical message. They wanted to teach brotherhood. They wanted to teach ethics. Their curriculum, their books are all about, have a very strong universal thrust. If you read an uncensored 19 letters, you know, it's the praise of that great era of brotherhood of mankind, as shown in the Bible. They did not at all teach to ordinary people or even ordinary rabbis halacha or Talmud. Unlike when we get to American Orthodoxy today, which is all halacha, they thought only the Beth Din, the rabbinic court, has to know the law, and then for the common people, only know Bible, prayer book, wisdom of the fathers. They didn't even think, so if you see a Jewish history book, it's coming from a Russian origin. They didn't even think that was necessary. The ethics, the Enlightenment approach was what it was about, or even a place dealing rabbinic training, and this shocks more people. Hirsch had no rabbinic seminary, there was no yeshiva, he only was in charge of a high school, okay? And a real shul, not even a university-bound high school, because that's what the Orthodox businessmen wanted for themselves. And the actual rabbinic seminary, Hildesheimer, was a historiocritical method. It particularly didn't like some of the other people in Europe, but they were historiocritical in their curriculum. Someone like Hildesheimer gave courses on biblical criticism, Talmud criticism. You took other courses in the history of the Jews of Italy. It was nothing like we would say is a rabbinic training today. In the end, it's very much closer to the Jewish Theological Seminary of America's curriculum. In the end, just like Jewish Theological Seminary, you came out with not a certificate allowing you to have anything to do with Jewish law. You came out with a teaching certificate, basically from a German seminary. And you were now officiating in these many synagogues. But the goal was now to speak well, to speak a good German sermon, because that was very important in German culture, to have your children get music lessons. And that Orthodoxy had had very little effect on American Jewry, because most of American Jewry came from Eastern Europe. And they weren't the founders of almost any institution in America. There are a few, or Chaim in Manhattan, the congregation. There are a few things the German Jews founded, but the majority was founded by the Hebrew humanists. And that contrast is important. Moving now to America. In America, the 1925 to whenever you think it ended, was that a small alienated minority of graduates of at that point, Isaac Elchanan Theological Seminary, connected to Yeshiva University, who went out and now populated pulpits, but they came to be in a struggle with the conservative movement. So a line got drawn there in America that wasn't in Europe. Much of what we call the traditional conservative movement of the 50s and 60s was on the British, Italian, French side, part of Orthodoxy. The line got drawn in America in a very different place. Therefore, the curriculum in America immediately became the study of Talmud in a non-critical way, distinguishing it sharply from the education and the conservative movements. And the emphasis was now not on history, but on philosophy, modernism. And they said they were modern Orthodox rabbis, which is interesting because in England, France, Germany, all the other seminaries were historic-centered. This seminary is now saying if we're doing anything besides Talmud, it's going to be philosophy, it's going to be modernism. And they went out trying to say that Judaism is this worldly, modern. But I'm going to give you some specific examples. President Samuel Belkin, who was president of Yeshiva University, was really the one who was in charge, and almost everyone I'm going to be talking about was part of his kitchen cabinet. He said that Orthodox Judaism is democratic and follows American democracy. It follows the ideas of melting pot and pluralism. It follows the ideas of synthesis. You have to get a college education and a Jewish one and synthesize something new. It includes figures like Rabbi Rachman, who said that in our age you can't have any authority or hierarchy because we're modern and democratic. You had Eliezer Berkowitz, who tried to grapple as much as possible with modern issues, even if he was rejecting a modern point, but he dealt with it. And all mitzvot, if you look at the literature from this time period, was all showing you whether it was the laws of marriage or death. They're psychologically good for you. They fit into your suburban life, and they are good for you. They used Charles Liebman, the pop psychologist, and others, but that was the world they were inhabiting. That gave way in the 1980s to a new movement, which I'm willing to call centrism. And I use it not to say that it's not a form of modernity, just to distinguish it from the 1950s version. In the 1980s, we had a new version of what's centrism, in which now halacha came to play. You now see, instead of studying philosophy or Judaism as a whole, you now study halacha. You go gap years in Israel to study Jewish law. Jewish law is the basis for everyone having a discussion. And older principles gave way in new ways. So for example, dealing with take an easy case, when the 1950s, the old modern Orthodoxy said, we're modern, so we want to show that things are ethical. And therefore you always have to ask yourself, are you doing the right and the good? Are you making an existential choice to be ethical? Are you grappling with how hard it is? Already in the very beginning of the 1980s, someone like, you're already going to have centrist works that are going to say, no, there's no ethical concern. Everything is just a formal, objective form of law. So whether it's Aaron Levine's Economics, who one of the first that came out in the genre, and then afterwards you then had J. David Blythe coming on and saying everything is objective, everything is law. Don't even think that there's a personal element. Don't think marriage is about love. It's a legal category. Or, to make sharp terms, where the old modern Orthodox all wrote articles saying what we're doing in Vietnam, having to discuss whether it's ethical or not, and whether you can have collateral damage or not. This new centrism basically said it's an incidental, for those who know Hebrew, it's a psik reisha de lo nichale. It's a incidental we're not worried about, and therefore we don't worry about collateral damage in Kuwait or Iraq or anywhere else. That's a very new approach to all issues. The older modern Orthodoxy approached medical issues. Think of someone like Emanuel Jacobowitz. What was the ethical drive? What is we want ethics? And he modeled himself after the Catholic moral tradition, both Anglican and Roman. And the new medical ethics became entirely legal, with no human element whatsoever. Skipping down to where you see modern Yeshivish, and this is because we have, those who are here more modern. I consider much of what we have the modern Yeshivish, or the professional Aguda world, or all those figures who go to yeshiva and go to law school. They're a form of modern also. They're not the high modernism of the 1950s, but by the very fact that they can publish articles and op-eds in the New York Times, they can litigate before the Supreme Court, they can put out a whole shelf of self-help books. They are part of the parcel of many of the evangelical and other changes in America, and are part of a modern history, not anything looking back. And in some ways, part of their success is because they answered the needs of the 1990s in a way that many found helpful. Now I'll take your questions.
Professor Brill. So as per your general thesis, it seemed that all these different brands of modern Orthodoxy could be better understood given their historical context based on sometimes general issues like famine or poverty, sometimes were like ideological challenges like conservative Reform Judaism. But when it came to centrist Judaism, I found it a little more ambiguous as to what exactly that context was that gave rise to it. and also specifically how that relates to, like how you mentioned in passing, that centrist Judaism seems to have a very small, specific crowd, a countable number of communities that it arises in. So I was wondering if you can clarify a little more the context of centrist Judaism.
Let's talk about that very clearly. Old-time modern Orthodoxy, you only had rabbis who were educated. In the 50s and 60s, the congregants were barely had high school students. You were at probably your parents' age already. It was the first generation of being both Orthodox and going to college. And not only going to college, but going to medical school and law school. An approach about talking about medical ethics, legal ethics, was all tied up with a certain rise of the yuppie suburbia, the rise of the professionalism, the rise of everything from supply side economics to the rise of the evangelicals in America, the sense of a moral order. For as much as we think after that everyone can now have identity, their own religious identity, after the 60s and early 70s, many chose, let's say in the centrist case, that you can now be proudly Orthodox in public, which also plays a role within this. It became the greater role of choice within life, and therefore people chose, surprisingly, more traditional religions. I'm not sure if you have a specific point you want to...
I'm just more curious as to what it was specifically about the community's view.
For a community that's now staying up very late at night to get themselves into a top med school and law school, a halachic approach made perfect sense, and you made a Judaism that wasn't about ethical imperatives or philosophy. It was now about something that looked very much like your law school textbook, which does reflect what the community was going.
So it's limited to communities that pursue higher education.
Well, that becomes a separate thing. Is that it became very narrow. It became narrow because it actually doesn't fit demographically a lot of ordinary people who used to be ordinary Orthodox or whatever traditional of some form, and that was part of the rise of the engaged yeshiva world. It is much more comfortable for many people. You can't, since I live in Teaneck, the joke is you can't live there. I mean, not the joke, it's actually a statistic. If you're not making in the top 6% of America. If you have to live in the top 6% to be part of a community, it's a very narrow slice. Yes? Yeah.
Thank you, Dr. Brill. I have a question where you would characterize the modern approach of, say, people in your modern Yeshivish category being obsessed with critical editions of various svarim, various books, the use of footnotes more than ever before, and in the same field, perhaps in other people, perhaps the centrist field of people who have both rabbinic ordination and got dissertations in Jewish studies, and that's also perhaps become much more common. And where you would group that if you're discussing that at all?
Well, it becomes now a selective amount, and that's why the Yeshivish approach, the fact that they're using critical editions, and they want to take what they think is the best of the modern world, which is now producing historical critical editions, and then just now not citing everyone they relied on to get there. They want to then read through books and then produce this because they really do want the knowledge, but then they can play all sorts of games to then say they're going to get credit for it.
In terms of the second half, in terms of perhaps more people getting rabbinic ordination, also pursuing dissertations in the Jewish studies field.
Jewish studies dissertations actually were much greater number in the 70s. They dropped off to almost nothing in my time. Meaning, my era in the 80s and early 90s is like almost nobody, and it's only come back again in the last 6 years or so, that there's a huge, 100 people out there doing doctorates, but that's a brand new after a gap. Because during the 80s and 90s, your goal was to sit there and learn in a kollel and not do a doctorate. Yes?
So it is interesting that for the panel tonight, there could be sort of a perspective on Jewish Orthodoxy and Catholic Orthodoxy, and would have been, I think, a perspective on Islamic Orthodoxy.
Right.
But the idea of Protestant Orthodoxy doesn't make much sense. And at least in my head. And so I was thinking that of modernity as a response, modernity being more or less synonymous with liberalism and liberal democracy, and orthodoxy being a response to that, and whether liberalism, liberal democracy is sort of the political regime of Protestantism to some extent, and how both Catholic Orthodoxy and Jewish Orthodoxy, at least in America, are a response to living in a Protestant context, and that Orthodoxy being, and all the stuff you're talking about with choice, and so it's all very Protestant. So whether all this Orthodoxy is a response to suddenly living in a Protestant world.
Well, I'm not going to see what the first line is that the good plurality of America, if you take a statistic in 2002 or 3, was evangelical or evangelical sympathizer. So I'm not sure it's all on the progressive side, and there are many groups within that would see themselves as Orthodox forms of Protestants, and many people you're calling Protestants who wouldn't even see themselves as Protestants, but they're post-Lutheran Reformation figures who would self-identify that way also. In terms of the political issue, that's exactly what I'm not doing. I'm doing much more of an anthropology approach rather than that bigger, where do you fit into the public sphere. But even so, both centrism and engaged Yeshivish have been very much supporting those who want to bring religion back into the public sphere. So I'm not sure it's completely, because a lot in America, there's been a solid plurality that have been wanting to bring religion into the public sphere, and the huge increase. But that's really was not my topic. Yes.
I was really fascinated, the way you've constructed, your final definition. There's really an axis of acculturation and inclusiveness in the wider culture and separatism. And particularly in the last period of modernity, during the same time period, we of course have the rise of all kinds of religious cults and community, kind of communities going off by themselves. And how do you see this interaction of modern orthodoxy, particularly in this third period, with those kinds of contemporary separatist movements?
Okay, that's a great question. Right now, I was doing a view. I could do an alternate tying back to some of the points called local history and things that don't, local religion and things that don't fit into this. I'd be glad to give a whole talk on things, but right now you have trends like there's a new neo-Hasidic trend, which is now making waves of people who now want in some way take on certain parts. But the parts that they're taking on tend to be the non-God parts. They're taking on all sorts of, translating it into enthusiasm. You have things like outreach organizations, like some of the high school outreach, which bears a great similarity, but is not completely the same as the Christian rock movement and the Christian youth movements in America. You have, and then you have all sorts of now people using magic in the community because they're standard, Malkowski things that they just want. How do you deal with an illness? And if they can't deal with it in a rational way, they're dealing with it in a magical way. You find that in the community also. But not of any of the major figures, rabbinic figures. But if there's a real social history, then a lot of that stuff would play a role. Yes?
Yeah, I think it's a related question for both Dr. Moore and Dr. Brill. About your comment, Dr. Brill, on the ability of modern Orthodoxy to respond positively and engage the later period, the current generation, perhaps, in an internal way. If you could perhaps explain that and give an example.
The problems of it?
Sorry?
The problems, or are you looking for a solution?
Yeah, the problems that modernity presents and the ability of modern Orthodoxy to respond to it. And in the Catholic context, how does Catholic Orthodoxy respond to the current generation, if and how it can do so in an attractive way, in the back of my mind, I have the example of Pope Francis, for example, and some voices out there that think that that's being done at the expense of Orthodoxy. So how those play out?
Well, dealing with, at least on the American side, I'm going to leave out some of the other countries north. On the American side, the centrist engaged Yeshivish are not really catering and reaching out to poverty. They're not reaching out to the Jewish poor. They really are aiming at that 6%, the top 6%. And if you were unfortunately poor, you would no longer feel comfortable in the community. But it becomes even beyond that. The entire vision is one of not the common person. If we go back to the 1920s and 30s, there used to be this huge amount of stories and rabbinic approach of helping the poor, helping the common person. The person that you meet could turn out to be, no matter how poor, dirty, whatever they are, could turn out to be a great saint. All of that has really disappeared from the literature today. And it's noticeably missing. So in terms of not being able to reach, it's a very narrow segment. I'm not sure I got all the nuance of your question. If you want to ask something. Yes.
So,
oh, yeah.
in Catholicism, I just have to admit here that I'm from Argentina, so nobody can criticize Pope Francis tonight. That's where I start. I do think that much of the criticism from, now I'm going to appropriately, I think, use the right of Pope Francis, the American right, is a particular deafness to a certain kind of language and an understanding Francis's language in an American context. It just sounds different. And also having grown cultured or accustomed to pontificates of measured speech, spontaneity has its risks, and I'm fine with that. So that's Pope Francis. But the more serious question, I think, is how do Catholic Orthodox engage young people or liberal or center? I think there are both, right? Generational issues. And I do think that, of course, Catholic universities are not hotbeds for Orthodoxy, but I do think that there is a lot going on in Catholic universities right now, a lot of pockets of good people trying to reach the youth successfully. There's 6 of them right here, 5 more from row. No, and I do think it's working. I really do. Not on a national level, but I think there are really great pockets that you see in religious communities as well. Modest rises in religious vocations of orders that use a religious habit. For example, living community, pray the liturgy of the hours. So I actually think there's some modest hope there in the American context.
I just want to add something to that one. Is going back to 1976, 77, that's when the leadership of the start of what became centrism wrote off almost all the poor. In 1977, the majority of those who were Orthodox lived in places like the South Bronx, inner city, Newark. And basically, the leadership said, we're going to put all of our eggs in Teaneck, Bala Cynwyd, Silver Springs, Bollywood, here, Hollywood, all these places, all these put into only, which is whether it's 10 or a dozen neighborhoods, and really wrote off and didn't provide any services or rabbis or anything for the inner city. And it was a conscious, I'm still looking, people have told me about the meeting that occurred. I'm still trying to get my hands on the memorandum that was issued, because that memorandum did create a lot of what got created afterwards. But in terms of people who do care, that's why Chabad, Engage Yeshivish, Engage Yeshivish will put out books about what to do if you're unemployed, which you'll never see a centrist do. Chabad will cater to them or it's shipped to Israel, which I bracketed out, the Datiyim Chadashim will get there and be out there talking about those who are protesting the Occupy movements in a way you won't see in American Orthodoxy. Yes?
So this is sort of, I guess, a follow-up question to that thesis. We're talking about the present, maybe more than the modern age. And interestingly, Dr. Brill, so your timeline is very much modern, right? It stops 25 years ago. Then you mentioned the last 30 years have been a good time for religion.
Right.
And I
So
think
centrism is in the last 30 years.
what I think you're trying to say is postmodernism, right? Has been good for religion. So in the sense that a rejection of epistemological certainty has led some people to piety, to service, to experience religion in these sort of intense ways, which is why the evangelical movement, the Mormon movement, and so forth have made sort of great gains in this period. But to then return to Dr. Moreland through Charles Taylor on the table, to bring the epistemology back into it, how do the Orthodox, and as Professor Fishman said, right belief, how does that occupy a space in this post-modernity? Is it possible? And I mean, if you read, for instance, Joseph Ratzinger, right, who's known in Catholic circles as the epitome of Orthodoxy, he begins his introduction to Christianity, he begins with something of an epistemological gauntlet, right, that we have these doubts, and therefore everyone has doubts. And so there's this possibility that to overcome them is this sort of right belief. Is there anything like, is there that epistemological grappling going on at all in the Orthodox movement in Judaism?
Okay, I hear three questions there. I don't know the order to do them. In terms of, first of all, that piece you're quoting from Cardinal Ratzinger is from the 60s, I believe. It's like 66 or something. It's a very old piece, and he's grappling with the issues of the 60s, which is a different voice than we got 30 years later. He didn't start off with doubt. He started with a system certainty. But I've had students who've actually, gotten up and, written papers on things comparing Jewish centrist figures like Rav Aaron Lichtenstein about what is a Talmudic orthodoxy of the system to Cardinal Ratzinger's writings. They both have a very similar, that you must trust. Here is the system. You approach questions within the system, not epistemologically outside the system. So there is something to be made, but I'm not thinking about it on one foot because I don't want to. There is a similar movement, but the doxy becomes one of usually law, Jewish practice, made into a theoretical orthodoxy. Here's a list of how you have to approach something using Jewish law. The second point I think you made was what about today? I actually stopped my book in 2000 or 2003 just so I don't have to be dragged down in contemporary politics where everyone asks where I stand, because that's not my project. My project is not advocating for a specific group. However, I still keep track of it, and I still write papers and submit things on what's going on today. Within contemporary centrism, orthodoxy in America, engaged Yeshivish, we see a rise of evangelical influence. People in my neighborhood, in other neighborhoods, people who live in the Upper West Side of Manhattan are big Joel Osteen fans, Prosperity Gospel. You can hear it in the sermon. I keep track of it in the sermons. You have a lot of Rick Warren. I don't know almost any Orthodox rabbi today who hasn't read Rick Warren. There's a huge pop culture influence that you in some way integrate yourself within pop culture. That's another direction. There's now an Oprahism that's playing a big role, that's being presented as God's word. So as much as there's a talk about tradition, I think it's stronger since my degree is from Fordham and I teach in the Hall. The idea of real tradition without the conjunctive is stronger in the Catholic tradition than the Jewish one is a much more always seeking the conjunctive, which leads to all sorts of different places. Which gets what I said, that's why I thought it was a very valuable point of view. Yes?
Yeah, thank you. That's in fact a question I have been wanting to ask. The conjunctive impulse of modern Orthodoxy sounds kind of strange for someone in the Christian tradition where Orthodoxy always involves a certain interest in drawing boundaries.
Boundaries are drawn here too, but the boundary is saying this I can take, this I can't take.
Okay. So, I mean, so in the Christian tradition, Orthodoxy involves the possibility that there are heretics who are beyond the pale.
Oh, totally.
Yeah.
But the point is the Catholic tradition is a stronger humanist tradition, a stronger intellectual tradition outside of technical religion, and therefore the American Jewish Orthodoxy, not mainly coming from Italy, France, or England, mainly coming from Eastern Europe, did not come with a strong humanistic tradition, and therefore they will not phrase it. They will not phrase it as we are continuing the Jewish tradition. They will phrase it as the conjunctive. There are figures, I mean, if we get technical, back in the Western European sides that you didn't want to say it was a natural tradition, because if you were descended from Spanish Portuguese, you could really say, even if you're in England or in New York, you could say, you know, I'm descendant from whatever 12th, 13th century figure, and I'm continuing a humanistic tradition. But since the American language is all based on Eastern Europe, the conjunctive is really incredibly important. Okay, who did I not? Yes, in the back. You.
You talked about how the centrist movement's associated with legalism.
Yeah.
So
Not in a theological sense.
Not in a theological sense, but in a more practical sense. So how does Rabbi Lichtenstein, with his kind of emphasis on like 19th century humanism, play with that tradition or against it?
I'm not sure I'm following the question.
Like Lichtenstein seems to emphasize the idea of an ethic as external to the halacha. He seems
That's
to,
right. So he is a British idealist who believes that there's a Platonic ideal to society, and the true men of culture who've been properly trained are the ones who are leading it. And the training is going to come through the yeshiva experience. Well, then you'll now be cultivated enough to then create the correct judgments.
So that feeds into the kind of centrist. So that feeds into the centrist.
It's one of the most humanistic, it's the humanistic end of the centrism rather than the more legalistic end. But at the same time, it becomes a very clear orthodoxy that anything that's not done in the tradition, whether it's critical historic studies or even the reading of medieval philosophy, is outside of the orthodoxy. He has a very clear list of what's in and what's out. And I was very surprised over the years what's out. You know, very clear things like Bachya ibn Bakuda or Sadigon are out, which always surprised me. Yes?
Dr. Brill, it's great to be a student of yours again. Thank you. I have a question for each of you. You said that what we need is anthropology, and I love your anthropology of intellectual history, but a lot of what you talked about are ideologies or theologies. I wonder if you'd take a moment to comment on the communities, the social orthodoxies that are going on. Not necessarily in each camp, but if you had a few words. And then for Professor Moreland, I also want to ask you to comment about a couple things that you mentioned and to bring them into conversation. If I heard you correctly, I think one thing you categorized Catholics as is pilgrims awaiting a kingdom of God, and you also said that one thing we need to grapple with when we're talking about modern orthodoxies is the nation state and its existence. I wonder if you would comment about whether modern Orthodox Catholics or Orthodox Catholics are thinking at all about nation states in a different way in light of that characterization. So, two different questions. Okay. Sorry for that.
The anthropology is actually on my mind, and the fact that I'm speaking in 4 weeks down in Emory, the anthropology department, but there I have to bring slides. But it's a very different talk, because then it's the question is, how is the synagogue built? Is it already just a place to pray? The role of the social hall, the role of, you know, all sorts of, can it be a plain building? Will tell me all sorts of things about the denomination, which was just not my, like I said, I can talk a lot about it, but it was just not my.
I even meant the ability of communities to live up to those ideals. Flexidoxies.
What?
Flexidoxies in practice.
Right. In that, like I said, that's a different direction, but in that I see a lot of the varieties of orthodoxy fit Pierre Bourdieu's, here's the ideal and here's what people actually do, and it doesn't mean that everyone's ever going to admit it in public.
Right.
And then you can find a small percentage actually living up to the ideal. For a lot of these forms, there really was an ideal and practice was separate, but there was never anything saying, okay, let's now talk about practice. I mean, I wish some colleague would now write a history of the laity, of which there is some wonderful stuff on the Catholic side, but there's no Jewish history of the laity.
So can I ask a question of clarification? Are you asking me whether Catholic Orthodox today are interested in theocracies?
It wasn't so pointed, but it seems to me that a nation state has a certain identity that is connected to land in the way that an identity of a pilgrim is not.
Okay, sure. So absolutely. So that second point refers to Bill Kavanaugh's work, and so the point there is that what would have been termed the wars of religion really were more than just about religion, right? So my position is a pretty Augustinian, pessimistic one on that front.
Maybe this will be the last question, if that's okay?
Yes.
Sure, and this is for Professor Moreland, because, I mean, coming from the Catholic tradition, I find it really interesting, this sort of interplay between modernity and orthodoxy, right, and modern orthodoxy. And I wonder how much, and maybe this is specifically American Catholic, right, because Pope Francis sort of like blows up the paradigm, but how much of orthodoxy today in Catholicism is actually a rejection of modernity, right? I mean, you look at sort of Cardinal Burke, and you look at, you know, the return to altar boys rather than altar girls, right, which is sort of like the latest, I guess, contratemps in sort of the continuing culture wars, right? I mean, how much of that is like, you know, return to traditional family structures, return to sort of traditional, you know, ways of doing things, return of the Tridentine Mass, right, rather than the New Order Mass. You know, so I wonder sort of what space that occupies, you know, the tension that Orthodoxy has with modernity, and whether it's sort of greater than exists in Judaism, and whether there's a place for sort of modern Orthodoxy and where that sort of lies in the institutional church, you know, today.
I mean, actually, I think you've spoken really well about the resistance and real tensions that exist between modernity and Orthodox Catholic belief. I certainly think that that's true. That said, the way, for example, that Pope Benedict and then Pope Francis have allowed for the return of the Tridentine Mass is cast in pretty modern terms, sort of to each his own, let a thousand flowers bloom, you know. So in this way, I take the point that that even those wanting to turn back the clock in a certain way are turning it back in a pretty modern view, because that's in the air that we breathe. So, but I agree with everything you said.
I feel that this conversation can and should continue. I really know that you all join me in thanking our two speakers.